Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm excited today to have Mike Massimino. I think, holds the record for the longest spacewalk. He's a great astronaut, and he was the first one ever to tweet from space. And as I like to say, Mike, tweet others the way you want them to tweet you.
Well, I never heard that before, but that's good.
Hey, Mike, tell us a little bit about what you've been doing and tell us about some of the things that you accomplished. I know you don't want to brag, but I want you to kind of let people know what you did and what you're
Sure.
doing now.
Well, it's a pleasure to see you again, Governor. Thanks for having me on. Yeah, I'm a civilian. So I went the civilian route to becoming an astronaut. It took me a while. I was rejected three times, including a medical disqualification, but finally got in 1996 and was an astronaut until 2014. The two missions I had with the Hubble Space Telescope. You mentioned the spacewalking record. That record is a team record for the most time accumulated on a mission. We had five spacewalks on each of my flights. We had two different teams going out to do those spacewalks, and if you add up that spacewalking time, we have a record. We set it on my first mission, and then we broke that record on my second mission. And those missions were, as I said, to upgrade and repair the Hubble Space Telescope. So I did that until 2014, and then I joined the faculty at Columbia University, where I'm a professor, and that's what I do now. And in addition to other things, I've written a couple books and do TV appearances when the news asks me to come on and say something, and do some speaking events from time to time, different for different organizations and companies and so on. So that's what I've been up to.
Yeah, Moonshot, best-selling book, to 2023. Got to always promote
Mhm.
those books.
Thank you.
Mike, so when you were 10 years old, 9 years old,
Hmm.
I mean, what kind of a kid were you? I mean, how
Yeah.
could anybody ever want to be I mean, we know about astronauts, but none of
Yeah.
us ever think I could ever be one of those. How did this, give us the story?
Well, Governor, I never really thought I could either. I'm kind of shocked that I was able to do it. We're really very fortunate. But I was 6 years old when Neil Armstrong took those first steps on the moon, and that really changed my life. And I had the sense that it was, important to everybody, but it really meant something I think more meaningful to me.
At
Uh, As,
six. I
at
mean, at
six
six
years
years
old,
old.
yeah, I was really into it when I was 6 years old, and I was, throughout my childhood. But by the time I was about eight, I figured, this is never going to happen. That's when I discovered I was afraid of heights, and I still don't like heights, Governor. I just don't like them. But I had to learn to deal with them. Get out of my comfort zone. But I just thought it was impossible. When I was a senior in college, about to graduate with my engineering degree, I went to the movies and saw this movie, The Right Stuff. You might have seen. It's about
Oh yeah. Oh
the
yeah.
original seven astronauts that test positive.
Yeah.
It was based on a book by Tom Wolfe, and I read the book, and it had me thinking about what I was going to do with my life, with my career, and the astronaut thing still seemed a bit far-fetched, but I knew I wanted to try to be a part of the space program. So after working for a couple of years, I went to grad school and tried to prepare myself for a career in the space program, helping people go to space in different ways. I got interested in robotics and mechanical engineering is what I got my degrees in, and but kept trying. I mean, the goal was to try to become an astronaut, or at least to try to become an astronaut. Just keep trying, and I eventually, as I mentioned, got in there. But it was something I think it was those seeds were set, and I was a very little boy.
Okay, how do you try? There was, I think,
Hmm.
in the right stuff, it showed John Glenn out there running around in front of I don't know if it was true, run of the commanders, so he would get picked and all that stuff. But,
Yeah,
and now it's changing because a lot of people want to go up into space. Space
yeah.
is probably going to become a lot more available to certain people. How do you,
Mhm.
how do you pursue being an astronaut? How
Well,
did
for
you
the
do it?
NASA program, which what I was part of, which of course it still exists, every few years they will accept applications and they'll make an announcement. We are accepting applications for another astronaut classes. The deadline usually give you, I don't know, at least 6 months, maybe more to get a chance to get your application in. Now it's all online. It used to be, at the typewriter. It used to be at the type, but it's a standard form 171. I think it's still the same. Your standard government employee form that you fill out that has your education. You put down some references and who your supervisor was, and all your jobs and your hobbies, and they ask for a little more like supplemental information if you have any other, like if you do any flying, which I did a little bit. I had a private pilot's license, but I wasn't a professional pilot. But they'll ask you for some supplemental information, and maybe a little bit of medical background too for the NASA job. And you submit that stuff, and there's thousands of these. I think they have. I think the last go around, they have about 18,000 applications. So they get sorted through at different levels. The first level is just to see who's qualified, and that's most of the people that apply meet the minimum qualifications, and then they start being reviewed. And I was on the other side. Once you get picked, you get on the other side of it to help pick more people once you get in the office, and you whittle it down to who you think is a very good candidate. That's about 10%. You'll go out and get references on them, and they'll look at the references, and they have committees and people are looking at. Anyway, you finally, if you're fortunate enough, you become a finalist. There's about 120 finalists usually each time they do that. And they only do this every few years, and they'll interview those folks and pick out of that group who they like. But there's different gates to get through, different
So what
stages
did
of
they
it.
what did you when you went into that interview,
Mhm.
like you're down to 110? So you
Yeah.
went in there with a strategy, obviously. What did you tell them? When I was 6 years
Mhm.
old, I got
Yeah.
inspired, or
Yeah.
what was your strategy of being picked?
Well, Governor, by that point, by the time I got my interview, I was working. My first two times I applied and got rejected, I was in grad school. And in my third time, I was working at the Johnson Space Center, and I had a chance to get to know some of the astronauts just in the neighborhood and at church and different places. You start to make friends, and just natural like you would in your community and people I work with. And the biggest piece of advice I got from all of them was just be yourself, and don't try to answer a question in a certain way, thinking that you're somebody else. If you don't know the answer, just say, I have no idea what you're talking about. My friend Kevin Kriegel, who is from Long Island as well, an Air Force pilot who was already an astronaut when I met him. We grew up close to each other. He's a bit older than I, but he and I became good friends. And I remember him saying, if you don't know the answer, don't try to make it up, man. Just tell them I have no idea, or whatever, because you want to be honest with them and just be yourself.
What
And
kind of a
I
question
felt
would
that was
they
the best
ask you,
thing.
though? What, I
This
mean,
is
like,
it. Okay. So the question, I don't know what they're asking them anymore, but they try to ask. Sometimes they ask different questions, and they're like, forget it. What the question was is they start with you with is, tell us about yourself since high school. That was it. And so you would say, well, and then they would ask you why a lot. So you'd say, well, I graduated high school and I went to this school. And they would say, why? And you'd say, well, because whatever. And then, like, what did you study there? And you say, oh, I studied this. And they'll say, why?
why? Yeah.
And like different things. I remember, like I said, they said, if, I somehow I threw in there that I played the trumpet when I was in high school and college. And I remember Jim Weatherby, who was there, said, how many octaves could you get on your trumpet? And I'm like, oh man, there's a technical question there. So I think sometimes they just, they're just trying to make conversation with you. At that point, this is the way I felt about it. When you got to that point, you were qualified to do the job because there's so much scrutiny. Even to get an interview, they're looking into your background. They're calling people. They're trying to figure out who do they want to give one of those interview slots to. And at that point, then it's just seeing if you're a person they feel that would fit in. Are you a good person that they could get along with, that you could trust? And that's what I felt about it. And I think that's pretty important stuff when you're hiring people.
No,
Not
so yeah,
not only
for
can you do
sure.
the job, but can you get along and fit in? Yeah.
So, what was it like? What did they call you on the phone and say you're in?
Yeah.
And what
So
changed?
yeah, so what happened was the first time I was medically disqualified. I couldn't see the eye chart well enough, and they didn't have any recourse for me except well, I started asking questions, and I found out about something called vision training, and I was able to improve my eyesight so that I
Jeez.
could get. Yeah, I was desperate. They didn't. I'm thinking the only one that had an eyesight acuity issue overturned, and it was a number one reason for disqualifying people. Now it doesn't matter anymore. Progress now, they don't care. As long as you're correctable at 20/20, your unaided acuity doesn't matter. But I'm sorry. I lost track of your question.
No,
Ask
I
me,
said, what was it like? Did they? I
oh
said,
yeah,
did they
okay.
call
So
you
what
on the
happened was,
phone?
okay, I was okay. what happened was is that my second time I interviewed, I was in the same interview group as Mark Kelly, who's now a senator in Arizona, right? And Mark and I became friends during the interview and stayed in touch. And what he did is he reached out to me and said, "Hey, I'm part of this like email chain of with the military folks because he was in the Navy, and he
Right.
says I'd like you to add your name to it, so you can because the military people are really good about sharing information. Hey, we knew about this, we knew about that." So Mark was nice enough to add me to that email chain, and so I was getting like updates from the Navy and the Marine Corps and the Air Force, the Army guy. They would come in because they share. They're really good with teamwork and sharing stuff. And I remember it was a Friday, and one of the emails came across that someone had called to the office down to the astronaut office, and they said all the calls are going out Monday, good and bad. So I had a heads up that I was going to get a call that Monday, and then that Friday I just tried to keep my wits about me, and I stayed at home. I was working at Georgia Tech, but I stayed at home that morning because if I was going to cry, I wanted to cry at home. And then the phone rings, and of course, I was in the toilet, and my wife came and got me, and hey, there's a guy from NASA on the phone, and it was Dave Leetsma, who's the head of flight crew operations, and he says, "Mike, how are you doing this morning?" And I was like, "Dave, I don't know yet. You're going to have to tell me. How am I doing this morning?" He goes, "Well, I think you're going to be doing pretty well because we want to make you an astronaut, and we hope you're still interested." Like
Oh my
that's me.
gosh.
And I just
Yeah.
kept saying yes. And then, Governor, after I hung up I was so excited, and everyone was screaming and yelling, happy. And then I was like, maybe this was a prank. And I called the astronaut selection. I called them back. The guy named Dwayne Ross was the head of the selection office. Said, "Hey, I got this phone call. I just wasn't, I just want to make sure it wasn't a cruel joke by one of my cousins in Brooklyn or something." And he said, "No, no, it's
It's
that's it,
real.
Mike. You're in." So that
It's
was what
funny.
that day was like. Yeah.
Back when I was in Congress, I wanted to get on the budget committee. And
Hmm.
I remember I got a call from a guy because it was like how crazy this is. You had to go to the committee on committees and you had to get a certain number of votes to get on the committee you wanted. And he called me up and he said, "Yeah, you made it on the budget committee." I said, "You know what? That's the greatest news I've had since a guy called me and told me I made the Little League baseball team."
There you
So
go.
so
Yeah, yeah,
I understand. Well, you think
yeah.
about, impactful calls in your life, that's
Yeah, no,
really
it's
interesting.
there's some things, it's interesting. There's some things that happen. There's a before and there's an after. Sometimes it's a bad thing that happens, a big tragedy, and it's
Yeah.
before
Yeah.
and but
Yeah.
then there's some good ones too. And I remember the night before, my son was about 9 months old. My daughter was 2 years old. But I remember putting him to bed, putting my son down in his crib, and saying that night because I knew that call was coming, and it's like, "Daniel, tomorrow when I put you to bed, we'll know whether or not Dad's an astronaut." And
That's really
that
cool.
it was a before and after from when that phone call was made.
I've had a lot of calls, and some of them have not been very good. I
Yeah, that's
mean,
what happened.
tragic. But I
Yep.
did remember one that you might get a chuckle out of. I
Yeah, yeah.
remember George Bush called me, and he said because they were considering me to be his running mate, and he
Oh,
said, "No, I can't. We're not going to do that, John, because if you or I were in the same room together, we might blow the roof off the place." And we laughed, and then he went, and he ultimately picked Cheney and all that stuff.
yeah.
But make it
Wow.
long, that's a funny sort of
That's
call.
quite a call. That's
Okay,
a cool
okay.
call.
So now
Yeah.
we've got Artemis. So this is
Yeah.
this travel to the moon.
Hmm.
Mike, before we get to that, when
Hmm.
you're out there, how do you what are you walking in space?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
what is that like?
It is extraordinary. The thought of doing it, I've been, like I said, I've left the office in 2014, and so it's been 12 years since I was there. And some of the things I did, I think about. I'm like, how did I do that stuff? Or if I had to do it now, I'd be like, oh man, I don't know how I would ever do. But what it is that they train us so well that it seems normal, but it's still extraordinary. But like as far as like so you put on your spacesuit, and that's going to be what's keeping you alive. That becomes your spaceship. So, I really understood, but I understood how it worked. I knew understood every part of it, every emergency, everything. And you get ready, you put that thing on, and you get in the airlock, and they deep press the airlock, and you open up that door, and you go out, and it's
That's it.
amazing. Because you're like, when you're in space looking in the spaceship, you're looking out the window, right? When you first get there, let me look and see what it's like out there. You look at the stars, you look back at the Earth, and it's beautiful. But you're looking through a window and you're still wearing like regular clothes. You change out of your launch suit and you're wearing like regular clothes, and it's kind of like almost normal. But when you go outside in your own spacesuit and the whole like the whole sky just opens up, right? You can see anywhere you want. You can see the planet or the stars, and so you're out there to do a job though. So, but I remember looking up there, and I on my first spacewalk, I was with Jim Newman, was my astronaut buddy. He was an experienced astronaut and spacewalker, so he went out and made sure the coast was clear, and then he's up on the top of the bulkhead of the shuttle on a handrail. And he said, "All right, Mike, time for you to come out now." And so I just pop my head out of the airlock and look up, and I see him smiling. He had his visor up, and I see he's like, check this out. And above his head is Africa. So and it's beautiful, and I'm like, whoa, and I was like, whoa, it's Africa. And the thought went through my head was, how am I going to get anything done here? And then I looked straight ahead, and there were handrails and a vent duct and a foot restraint. And I said, I know what I'm doing. Just like in the pool where we trained on the water, and then I got to work. But so it's combination of trying to get your job done, because it's what you're doing. You is very important for you and for the space program, and you want to do a good job for the team, and at the same time you're in this extraordinary place, and with this, I think it's the coolest thing people can do. And the view of the planet is what overwhelms you. The thought I had, Governor, is when I had a chance to really look. The thought went through my head that this is a heavenly view, being up and away and looking at the planet.
Yeah.
And then it was another moment. I just, after another moment, I said, no, that's another thought came through my head that that's not right. That's not it. It's more beautiful than that. This is what heaven must look like. I think we're living.
So it's really a
in paradise.
spiritual. Did you
It
say,
was.
God, thanks for letting me have a look at this?
Yeah, I mean, the spiritual, I think everyone is affected in some way spiritually about it. If you're a believer, you might see it as, this is God's
Yeah.
creation and so on. But I've also flown in space with people who are not believers, atheists, or, they still, I think they're still affected by it, but they just interpret it a bit differently. But for me, yeah, it was like, what we are so lucky to be here, and what a beautiful place, what a beautiful home we have.
Yeah, it's just got to be so. And you were never frightened to be out there, right? Like when he said time to come out, did you ever like, oh boy, maybe I better not go out there?
No, it's too late for that. The
Yeah.
other thing I noticed, like in some of the stuff I did, I realized that there were a few occasions where there might have been, things might have happened during a flight or in our airplanes. We would fly our T-38 jets, and there was one time in particular had a hydraulic failure, and I remember thinking to myself, I should be scared, but I also remember thinking being scared isn't going to help. And there are times where, you really need, I think being scared is a luxury. If you can be scared, then it's not really that bad. But if you have to have your wits about you, and
You
have
were
to,
focused. You're focused.
you're really
So,
focused, and you're really, really well trained.
all
Yeah.
right, were you ever worried that after having those experiences,
Hmm.
which, a handful of human beings have had in the history of the world, did you ever worry that everything's downhill from here? That I'm never going to have this exhilarating moment, this,
Yeah, I don't know if I was worried about it. I think I realized that this is, that it's not going to be like this forever. And I got advice from a few of the veteran astronauts, the moon guys. They would come and talk to us. And I remember Jim Lovell. Have you ever had a chance to meet him, Governor? Did you ever get a chance
not
to meet Jim
Lovell.
Lovell?
I've met Neil Armstrong. I've
Okay,
met
cool.
Jim
Yeah.
Conrad. Of course,
Mhm.
I've met the second guy on the moon,
Buzz. Yeah, Buzz.
Buzz. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
So
another funny story.
they were all, great guys, yeah, but Jim Lovell gave me a piece of advice. It was the Apollo 13 movie, which was, of course, based on his story, came
Right.
out in IMAX, and it was in 2002 after my first flight, and NASA sent me to the premiere of it in New York, and Jim was there, and people were taking our photos, and he looks at me and he goes, Mike, I have a piece of advice for you. And I go, what's that? He says, fame is fleeting. He says, people are paying attention to us tonight, and tomorrow they're going to be paying attention to somebody else. And he goes, you have to realize that fame is fleeting. And if you don't accept that, you're not going to be happy. And
Boy,
gave
that's
examples of that.
that's true. Now,
And
when you
yeah.
and here's a I don't know if you've been interviewed a million times. I hope this interview is fun for you because
It's
I'm trying
great,
to,
man. I
yeah.
love it. I
So let
appreciate
me
it.
ask you this.
Yeah.
So here you
Yeah.
are with your wife, right? You're
Mhm.
on vacation. You go to
Mhm.
Europe, or you're
Yeah.
hanging out, and
Yeah.
you're with a group of people.
Yeah.
Did you ever want to tell somebody, hey, I was an astronaut. I mean, how do you handle that? Because they're not
Yeah.
recognizing you, right?
Right.
And
No, no, they
so
don't. Yeah.
and so when they
Yeah.
see you, you say, "What do you do?" You say, "Well, I did a spacewalk." I mean,
Yeah.
how do you handle that?
I usually don't say that. I usually say, I just say whatever, I'm a professor at Columbia or whatever.
Yeah.
It really depends. It doesn't all, it's sometimes, it's a pretty good intro though. I'll tell you that much. It's a really good one. Like if there's someone you want to meet,
Yeah.
and you say, "Hey, I'm Mike," you'll be like, "Okay, fine." But if you get introduced, I was at a book. It was a book party for my friend Brian Green, and the actor Paul Rudd was there. I don't know if you ever met that guy, right?
Yeah, I know who he
So he
is,
was
right?
there, and everyone's like clamoring around him, and we weren't gonna, he seemed like people were just asking him stuff. But Brian's wife was there, and she's like, "You need to meet Paul Rudd." I go, he's busy," and she goes, "Don't worry." So she introduces me as an astronaut, and of course, that ended the other conversation. I got a chance to speak to him. So that's helpful in those cases where if
Yeah.
you want to meet
I
someone or something like
yeah.
that, it is helpful in that regard. But don't expect anything special. You're not going to get a table at a restaurant any
Oh, yeah, you
quicker.
do. You get an extra
Oh,
meatball. Now,
I
come
don't know.
on,
They don't. I
Mike.
don't think I was. So I was at. No, I don't think that. I don't know. Push comes to shove, you should. Don't expect anything. That was another thing I got from Alan Bean, who was the
Yeah.
fourth guy on the moon out of the 12 people who walked. And a piece of advice when I was leaving, he became a good friend and mentor of mine. And when I was getting ready to leave NASA, I went to his house. He still lived in Houston, and I spent some time with him and his wife. He was a painter as well. He was an artist, so he had his studio at his apartment. And I was just talking to him, and he walked me out, to the car as I was leaving, and he said, "I do have one piece of advice for you." Again, like Lovell's advice, but his was never feel entitled at all to anything. You're not owed anything.
These
You
are
had a
really
great
good
opportunity to
guys.
do something.
Boy.
Do not feel entitled. He says that's the kiss of death. And if you start feeling that entitlement, you're asking for trouble. And I thought that was so. Yeah, no, no, don't expect any good tables at a restaurant or any special treatment. I'm saying this because I was just in Phoenix speaking at an event, and it was a really great, it went really well to talk. There was 1,000 people in the audience, and then I went to go get something to eat, and I couldn't get a table at the restaurant. And they didn't know who I was, but the people were coming in, and they were like, "You can't." I go, "No, I can't get a table." And one of the attendees told a nice young lady who was taking names that, this guy just spoke to you. It didn't matter. I think it made it worse.
I'll tell you a
Yeah,
funny
yes.
story though, Mike. You'll
Hmm.
like this. I was
Yeah,
stuck in Chicago. Huh. Isn't that stuck in
that happens.
yeah, like
Winter.
every day, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I was there for like 4 or 5 hours and I wanted to get into the lounge.
Hmm.
And so I went in and said, "Could I buy a day pass?" Well, no, we
Yeah,
don't sell any day passes.
yeah,
No, the
yeah,
answer
yeah.
is no. And so I hitchhiked in. You know how I did it?
No.
Because when I get recognized, um, I get recognized when I travel,
Hmm.
and I'm standing outside. I think I'll just stand outside the club until somebody recognizes me, and then they'll invite me in. And it's
Perfect.
exactly, I hitchhike my way
Wow.
into the
Yeah.
club. Oh, it
Yeah.
was great. But anyway,
That's
yeah, fame is fleeting and everything.
yeah.
It's really interesting for somebody like you that was, such the center and then gone. It's an interesting thing, so you can't cling to that, and I like
Yeah.
that. So, all right,
Yeah.
look, that's fun. Let's talk a
Yeah.
little bit of business here. So,
Hmm.
one of the young guys that works with me, Kevin Bingle, he just loves you and Artemis and
That's
everything.
very kind.
Okay,
Yeah.
so why are we going to the moon again? We've been there,
Yeah.
done that. Why are we going?
Yeah, we did that. The objectives were different. It was a long time ago, over 50 years ago. The missions, I think the Apollo missions, I think are the greatest accomplishment ever, and I don't know if we'll ever top that, in my opinion. At least not in space. Even if, first person on moon, I mean, on Mars and all that. I don't think it can. They did it at that time and so quickly in the 60s with the technology they had, and our country was all in. The amount of spending for that program relative to what we had tax dollar wise was huge, and it was a national priority. to get people to the moon before the Soviet Union, for the Americans to beat the Soviet Union there. And so it was like all hands on deck, and it attracted the talent not only from our country but from around the world, from Europe and other countries. They attracted people from all over to contribute to this. And I don't know, it's kind of like the building of the bomb, more or less, in World War II. I think that sort of effort happened, of course, for much different reasons. And I don't know if we ever could do something like that ever again. So that's a great accomplishment. Um, the only unfortunate thing was is that after that final mission, the last three missions to the moon were canceled. They're supposed to be Apollo 18, 19, and 20. They were canceled for once we had accomplished the goals. They didn't want to spend any more money, and they stopped at Apollo 17, and we haven't gone back to the moon since. So that's really the only unfortunate thing. But if you look at exploration, for example, over 100 years ago, they were trying to get to the poles, to the North Pole and the South
Right.
Pole. And they got there. And then once they got there, that mission accomplished, they went back home, and we didn't set up a station, for example, in Antarctica until 50 years later. So I think now we're at the point where, although it's very expensive, the relative cost now for doing that has to be much less for the taxpayer anyway than it was back then. You just can't afford to do it. But with the alliances we have with other countries and the alliances we have with private enterprise now, with some of these private companies, makes it possible. So I think one thing is that now it's possible to think about doing this again, because it seems like we should be able to afford to go back there, but not just to go back and take a look or go back in a few days and then return, is to go back and set up a research station there toward the south pole of the moon. We kind of aimed for the center of the moon last time, where it was easier to land. It's not as rocky of terrain. But the South Pole, there's a water source there. They're pretty sure there is water trapped near the southern pole of the moon, so you can use that to keep people alive and also as an energy source as well. So it's a more interesting place to go to, and the idea is to go there and remain. Use the materials, the soil, the materials that are there to help build a habitat, and be able to have this infrastructure where you have an orbiting station where astronauts can go up and down, and you can refuel spacecraft between here and the moon. So it's a much more elaborate plan, but it's one that's going to sustain us there as a permanent presence on the moon, similar to the permanent presence we have right now in low Earth orbit on the space station. Something similar, but much more complex and much harder to do, but similar in spirit, that once we go there, we establish that foothold and we stay there.
And then, so what does that mean to the family that's, guys working in the factory, the woman's got a part-time job in a grocery store,
Mhm.
and it's going to cost a lot of money, and they're saying, well, what do we need to do that for?
Yeah, and I understand that. If you look at what the space program is not as important as the other things we spend our money on, like food and housing and healthcare and so on. But I look at it as an investment in the future. The relative to the other parts of our government, it takes a small portion of our tax dollar. But I think the advantage here too is that now we've reached a point where it's economically feasible with these private companies. Some of the most successful
Right.
companies we have, like SpaceX and Blue Origin, and there's lots of startups, and there's countries around the world that are building rockets. And what they found was they said, well, we don't have much of a need for it. But that's because you could ever get there. What's happening now is that since the access to space has been so opened up compared to where it was 10 years ago, there are researchers and entrepreneurs and people thinking, well, what can I do in space to make money? So I don't think it's going to be totally on the taxpayer like it was for Apollo
Yeah.
to do this.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be some investment by our country and other countries, significant investment, of course. But the idea is that it's going to be sustainable, and that private enterprise will be able to benefit from this as well. And it will lead to a thriving space business like we have right now in low Earth orbit, where they're building private space stations to replace the International Space Station. I think the hope is that that next step is on the moon. We've had private missions to the moon as well. There's a private payload program, a commercial payload program, where there have been a few spacecraft. Not all of them have landed successfully, but they've been with a little bit of seed money from NASA. they've been able to land a few of them successfully. And even when you don't land successfully, you learn a lot. Where they've had private payloads on the moon. So I think that's to me that's the big difference. Where it's I don't know
Right.
if it's really affordable yet. It's really still going to cost the taxpayer money and also these private investors as well. But it's certainly a model that I think will work.
Uh, well, I know it could also be a gas station, on the way to
Yes, yes,
Mars.
that's right.
But let me just say, it's a good answer, but it's not really a great answer
Mm.
because why does it matter to that family? Why does it matter to
Yeah.
me? I mean,
Hmm.
are we gaining, what are we gaining from it? What is the specific benefit? And I think that was something that was never explained, which is
Yeah.
why the space program waned.
I think,
Um,
yeah.
so what is it that we get here that is really significant?
So my answer probably doesn't help anybody necessarily to that. But I think what we're really getting is a greater understanding of what's around us. So, thousands of years ago, we didn't understand how to predict the weather, or we still have
Right.
good luck with that now too. But we didn't understand what earthquakes were about, or what a tidal wave, how that happened, and we didn't understand what were the effects we had on the environment, and we just didn't understand that much. And so a lot of things were kind of made up, and people didn't know what was going on. And if you look at where we've come, even in the last 100 years is huge, and where now we have things like air travel, and that helps a lot of people get places. And we understand how the planet works, and we're starting to understand how technology has been developed to help us in our daily lives, in our phones. Look at where we have just in our pocket, our pocket phone compared to
Yeah.
what we had 20 years ago. So it 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 increased our understanding of things, of technology. It gives us opportunities to develop things that we might not necessarily need.
We may not even be able to anticipate exactly what the
We
benefits are,
we
but there's
won't.
something
Yeah.
about mankind wanting to explore, right?
Yeah.
And so
No.
this is, and I know I'm still not sure we'd give everybody the answer, but we don't know all the benefits that can come right
We
now.
don't.
And as long as private sectors, I'm for it. I
Mhm.
mean, how could you not be for the next exploration, the next
Yeah.
great mission? I think one of them is exploring the brain, but that's not inconsistent with exploring the universe.
Yeah.
Um, the environmental question. I mean, I had a person with Blue Origin tell me you can put factories there, so you're not going to continue to pollute the earth and deal with the challenges that we have here. What do you think about all that?
I think that is a very noble reason to want to go there, to get the pollution off the planet. And Blue Origin, Jeff Bezos' company, and I've heard him say several times that that's what his goal is for his company, is to move the pollution, to what we're doing to our planet, off our planet. I think that would be great if we're able to do that. We can maybe use energy sources from space, the solar power, if we could figure out a
Yeah,
good way to
that's
harness
true.
it so we can use it down here. Um, Putting things on the moon that we don't want to here on Earth, heavy industries, power plants, data centers, all these things that they're talking about doing. I think it sounds pretty science fiction like, but if you're able to pull that off, that's great. But I guess the way I see it, Governor, is that we really don't know. When we started looking around and we started sending people to space, it gave us a different perspective. And we didn't know what the planet even really looked like until Apollo 8, when they orbited the moon and they took that famous photo. It's called Earthrise. It turned into a stamp, and you see it.
Right.
It supposedly it influenced the environmental movement. We never knew what the planet really looked like. And when people would draw the planet, it had, like, the continents and stuff on. But really, what it is it's a blue planet with clouds. It's a lot of water in it, and we didn't even know what the planet looked like. And that one photo changed our understanding of the planet. The Hubble Space Telescope was launched like, well, why is this telescope important? And they said, well, we're going to look for planets and other solar systems, and they found that stuff. We're going to look for black holes, and they found them. But there was something they never even knew to look for, and that's dark energy, which is an energy source that is making, not only is the universe expanding, but it's accelerating. They wouldn't even know to look for something like that. But there
Yeah.
was a discovery that led to the awarding of a Nobel Prize. So I think going into space gives us that different perspective on things and opens up our understanding of things more than we ever could have otherwise.
By
And
being here. Well, if you
yeah,
just take the solar, take the energy, so the
mhm,
debate now is data centers and do we now turn, gas powered plants, run into data centers. And now
mhm.
there's talk about the small nuclear reactors and all that. But if all of a sudden we could figure out a way to vector, how about me using that word? I
I
just
like
always
that
wanted to
physics
use it.
word.
I never
That's a
used
good
it
one.
before. You could
Yeah,
vector it in such a way that the power of the solar, of the sun itself, being directed here in such a way
yeah,
that could dramatically reduce people's energy bills, run everything
yeah,
more efficiently, more effectively, live longer, healthier, less problems with lungs. I mean, I'm just talking out loud here, but
yeah.
that's what I think. You
And no,
never
I,
know.
I agree. It increases our understanding. It gives us, it answers big questions. And I think that's what science and engineering can do is answer some of those. And they answered, we know a lot of stuff. We know a lot more. We have these great devices to help us. But 10 years from now, it's going to make what we have look, really childish, what we'll know. And I think for some of the big questions, like how do we get here? How do we make our lives better on this planet? Is there anyone else out there? Is there life somewhere else? Those big questions, I think, need to be answered by getting that different perspective that we get from space. Now, does that help you put food on the table tonight? No, but maybe it'll help, maybe a few years
You
from
don't
now with
know.
what we learn. Yeah.
All right, here comes the big curveball. Okay, it's so easy for you. You're the best speaker. You're unbelievable. All right, AI.
Yeah.
Good, bad, both, scary, wonderful. All right, go, Mike.
I think it's probably a little bit of each. I think that, like me as a professor at Columbia, I don't like my students using it. I tell them not to when they're doing their problem sets, and so there are certain things that I think that it could, if it starts replacing the way we think about things or problem solve. I don't know if that's great, at least from that perspective. I'm dealing with that issue right now in my classroom, so that's why I bring that one up.
Yeah.
But I think overall, it's once we figure out how to embrace it, I think it's a very good thing. In the space program, I think it's been a big plus for us. The example I give people is the space shuttle was based on 1970s computing technology and was really hard to change those computers. We could do a very rudimentary upgrade of the software. They did that once a year only, because it had to be, validated and so on. And what that meant is that most of the flying of the spaceship was done by the astronauts and the folks working with the folks in the control center to understand what was going wrong. And it really showed up in our training dealing with emergencies. Um, you had to be able to handle everything because there was not much computing power to help you. And so you might have and it was a complicated spaceship. So you might have like an electrical bus go down, you have a short circuit here, and you have this go over here, and you had to figure out what it was and how do you run the procedure. And that took an enormous amount of human power to do that. I asked the pilot on my first flight how much of his training for our mission. So the pilots had to really know this stuff. They were test pilots. We were there to help a little bit, but our job was to do the spacewalks and other things. But the pilots, I asked, how much of your training for our first mission did you not use in space? And he said 99.99999% of it, because they had to be able to handle everything. And maybe one or two little things came up, but that was nothing compared to all the stuff that they had to learn for the 6 years that we were astronauts. Dwayne Carey Digger was our pilot. We were in the same astronaut class. So now it's different. Now, when you show up at NASA, because of the way the spaceships are now, they're almost like amusement park rides. No offense to the current astronauts. There's not even a control stick on the SpaceX vehicle, which kind of offended a lot of our test pilots. It's all touchscreens. But the computing power and the AI can figure out so much to handle, especially handle those emergencies, that the training to fly in the spacecraft, there's only a couple of weeks. You know, you go out there to SpaceX and you get some training. And some of my friends have said you can even cover it with a PowerPoint presentation because it's mainly just kind of you're part of the sim, but it's mainly the computer and the control system, the control team, and so on. It's a much different thing. And what's that's done, it hasn't necessarily gotten rid of people in space, but it's freed up the current day astronauts to be able to concentrate on other things like the experiments and the science and the spacewalks and the other things that they're going to be doing. So it's cut down the training dramatically, and it's made it much, much safer to go to space. So I think it depends. If it replaces our ability to think, I don't like that in the education. I'm a little worried about it. But as far as our everyday lives and being safer and being able to do more, I think it's a good thing, and it's going to be here anyway. So we have to be able to figure it out. Even in education, I think that some of my colleagues that I teach with have embraced it and actually assigned their homework assignments, for example, with the use of AI in it. So I think we have to figure out how we can use
What
it
are the
because it's
rules?
there. Yeah.
Man versus machine, who wins?
Yeah. Yeah, that's the question, right? I think it's human and machine working together
There
is
you
really
go.
what we want, and that's what we've had in the space program. And now with this AI, it's kind of it's a different element to it, and we have to figure out how to best use it. But overall, I think it's a great thing. I think it's because it's what is coming next and is going to be helpful
Yeah,
to
you
us
can't run
in
away.
the
Got to have
future. Yeah, no,
some.
you can't.
Yeah.
It's going to be there, so you've got to figure out how to use
Well,
it.
and we got to
Yeah.
have some controls and guardrails, but that'll all be for another day. But
Yeah.
Mike, I hope we can do this again. This is so
Oh,
much
count me
fun.
in.
This is
Count me
so
in.
much fun. You are just incredible, and
Yeah.
thank you
Thank
for
you.
your service.
Thank you for yours, Governor, and keep up the good fight. It's really a pleasure to be here with you.
All
Thank
right, and if
you.
I'm ever in your area, I'm going to come and
Oh,
get you to
please
buy me
do.
a cup of coffee.
Oh, I will do that. You can come to my class if you want. You can sit in. It's an easy class, so you'll be. But
All
no, I'd
right.
love to see you. Yeah, no, love. I'm in New York. Love to see you.
All right, sir. Thank you.
Thanks,
God
Governor.
bless. All
You
right.
bet.
Bye.